Hello everyone, tonight we are traveling back to a hot, dusty morning in southern Italy, the year 216 BCE. If you think the summer heat in your hometown is unbearable, imagine marching in full armor, no air conditioning, and absolutely no iced coffee. That's the kind of morning the soldiers of both Rome and Carthage were dealing with as they prepared to make history at a little place called Cannae. Now, before we get into the grit and glory, let me just say this is going to be a long night. For you, if you try to fight sleep while listening to this story, you will not survive. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment below with where you're tuning in from and what time it is, because I love seeing the little map of our story listeners come alive across the world. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soft background music, and let's get started tonight. The morning in Apulia was no ordinary morning. Dust rose from the trampled earth as thousands of boots and hooves shuffled into position. Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian commander, was already a living legend by this point. He had crossed the Alps years earlier with elephants, yes, real elephants, and managed to keep an army together despite hunger, frostbite, and cranky Gauls who weren't always sure they wanted to be part of his grand plan. That alone should have been enough to make the Romans a little nervous. But Rome, being Rome, had an ego as wide as the Mediterranean, and they weren't about to admit fear in front of anyone. The two armies stared at each other across the dry plain, separated by a thin morning haze. The Roman force was massive, nearly double Hannibal's. It was as if the Republic had said, "Fine, you beat us at Trebia, and you embarrassed us at Lake Trasimene, but this time we're sending everybody." In fact, Cannae may have been one of the largest armies Rome had ever assembled up to that point, a crowd of citizens, allies, and soldiers packed into the red-crested ranks of the legions. It was intimidating though, to be fair. Historians still debate whether Hannibal was impressed, amused, or just thinking about lunch. Strangely enough, not all soldiers looked like the neat, uniform legionaries you picture from movies. Hannibal's men were a patchwork quilt of cultures: tough Spanish infantry with curved swords, North African cavalry riders, Gallic warriors swinging long blades, and Carthaginian veterans who had followed him through years of hardship. It was like a traveling circus, except, instead of juggling, they specialized in stabbing Romans. The air was dry, and the river Ophidus trickled nearby, offering a little water, but also ensuring the battlefield was hemmed in tightly. Imagine standing there, sweat dripping under a bronze helmet, dust clinging to your face, and the knowledge that in just a few hours, this ground would be soaked with the outcome of your fate. The tension must have been unbearable. But here's a weird little off-topic detail. The Romans, for all their seriousness, still practiced strange battlefield rituals. Some soldiers carried tiny good luck charms, amulets, carvings, or even dried bits of animal bone tucked into their belts. A few had been known to rub oil mixed with crocodile dung on their skin, believing it offered protection. Yes, crocodile dung. If you're starting to think ancient warfare was less about tactics and more about creative skincare routines, you're not entirely wrong. Meanwhile, Hannibal was calm. He had learned long ago that numbers didn't guarantee victory. Strategy, terrain, and psychology often mattered more. His army, though smaller, was disciplined and trusted his leadership. He had led them through mountains, starvation, and constant battles. By now, they believed he could outwit anyone, even the stubborn Romans. On the other side, the Romans were fired up. With so many soldiers packed shoulder to shoulder, their confidence soared. Some even joked that they wouldn't need swords, just pressing forward together would squash the Carthaginians. Note to self: overconfidence is a terrible battlefield tactic, right up there with "let's invade Russia in winter." As the sun climbed higher, the golden light hit both armies. Shields glinted, helmets sparkled, banners flapped in the breeze. It was like a silent contest of intimidation, a staring match across the dusty field. But beneath the bravado, both sides knew what was at stake. For Rome, it was survival of the Republic's pride. For Hannibal, it was a chance to finally break their grip on the Mediterranean. And as the day stretched toward battle, one thing became clear. Cannae wasn't just going to be another clash of swords. It was going to be the kind of story that generals, centuries later, would whisper about, replaying the tactics in their minds as if it were a perfect chess match carved in blood and dust. But of course, the soldiers back then weren't thinking about history books. They were thinking about staying alive long enough to eat dinner. The Roman consuls in charge that day were Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, two men who could not have been more different if they tried. Varro was a brash populist, the kind of guy who believed in bold moves, fast action, and probably shouting a lot. Paulus, on the other hand, was cautious and deliberate, a man who preferred to weigh every option before lifting a finger. Historians still debate whether their joint command was brilliant or a disaster waiting to happen. But let's just say putting these two in charge of one of Rome's biggest armies was like asking two chefs with opposite recipes to cook one giant stew. Varro had command on the morning of the battle, and he was determined to crush Hannibal once and for all. No more embarrassing defeats, no more stories about elephants crossing the Alps, and certainly no more jokes at Rome's expense. This was his day to prove that Rome's numbers could drown Carthaginian cunning. Hannibal, of course, had a different recipe in mind. He positioned his forces carefully, a convex, outward bulging line of infantry in the center, yes, bulging, like a stretched-out bow. His flanks, anchored by his most reliable troops and deadly cavalry, waited with deceptive patience. To an eager Roman commander, it looked like weakness. To Hannibal, it was the beginning of one of the most brilliant traps in military history. The Roman infantry stood in their massive block, thousands upon thousands pressed tightly together. If you've ever been stuck in a crowded subway car during rush hour, imagine that, but everyone's carrying spears and shields, and they're sweating twice as much. Their formation was packed deep, maybe deeper than it should have been, because Varro believed that sheer weight would punch through Hannibal's center like a hammer through glass. He wasn't worried about finesse. He was betting everything on brute force. On the sidelines, the Roman cavalry fidgeted. They were fewer and less skilled compared to Hannibal's Numidian riders, those North African horsemen famous for darting in, throwing javelins, and vanishing before anyone could catch them. Think of them as the sports cars of ancient warfare, zipping around in circles while Rome's cavalry was more like clunky ox carts trying to keep up. Not exactly a fair race. Now, here's an odd side note. Some sources say that Hannibal himself had been recovering from an eye infection during this campaign, possibly even losing vision in one eye. Imagine leading one of the greatest tactical battles of all time, while winking permanently. It's the kind of inconvenient detail that history often forgets, but it makes you appreciate the man's focus even more. As dawn gave way to the full glare of the sun, Varro ordered the advance. Trumpets blared, and the Roman juggernaut began to move. Dust rose like storm clouds, filling the air and choking throats. Step by step, the legions surged forward, their shields clanging, their sandals pounding the earth in unison. To anyone watching, it looked unstoppably like a tidal wave about to smash through Hannibal's frail defenses. But Hannibal's line bent backwards slowly, deliberately, absorbing the impact. His troops in the center gave ground step by step, luring the Romans deeper. The bulge flattened, then began to curve inward. It was like watching a door close in slow motion, except the Romans didn't realize they were walking straight into the frame. Meanwhile, the cavalry clash on the wings was fierce. Hannibal's cavalry, especially the Numidians, moved with a kind of chaotic grace. They darted, feinted, and harassed the Romans, creating confusion and panic. The Roman cavalry, less skilled and heavily outnumbered, began to falter almost immediately. One might even say the Romans were outhorsed before they were outmaneuvered. Yes, that's a terrible pun, but hey, if I don't lighten the mood, this story is going to get grim very fast. Back in the infantry fight, the Romans pushed harder, convinced they were on the verge of breaking Hannibal's line. The pressure from behind forced the soldiers in front to keep advancing, shoulder to shoulder, with no room to maneuver. Imagine being squeezed in a mosh pit where the band is playing for keeps. There was no escape, no flexibility, only the suffocating press of bodies moving forward into the trap. At this moment, Hannibal signaled his flanks. His stronger infantry and cavalry swept around like a pair of jaws closing in. The Roman army, so proud of its numbers, suddenly found itself surrounded on three sides. And then, as the Carthaginian cavalry returned victorious from chasing off the Roman horsemen, the trap snapped shut completely. The Romans were encircled, a nightmare formation known as the envelopment. It was a masterpiece of tactics. But for the Romans, it was the beginning of horror. Men who had marched into battle with confidence now realized they were penned in like cattle. The pressure grew unbearable, and even raising a sword became difficult in the crush. Some accounts say men suffocated without ever striking a blow. Historians still debate the exact numbers, but it's clear that what followed was one of the most catastrophic defeats Rome ever suffered. But before we jump into that grim aftermath, let's pause here. For now, picture the moment right before. Chaos fully erupted, Hannibal's army tightening its noose, the Romans pressing forward without space to breathe, and Varro realizing maybe too late that numbers alone don't win wars. The trap at Cannae had fully sprung. Hannibal's men, once appearing to retreat, now surged forward with renewed vigor. His flanks pressed inward like the arms of a giant squeezing shut, while his cavalry closed the circle from behind. The Roman legions, so proud, so numerous, so determined, were now crammed together in a suffocating knot of humanity. The chaos inside the Roman formation was unlike anything most soldiers had ever experienced. Imagine thousands of men packed so tightly that they could not lift their arms to swing their swords. Some tried thrusting blindly, others simply raised shields and prayed. The unlucky ones near the center of the mass began to suffocate from the crush. It was less a battle than a slow-motion disaster, like being trapped in an overcrowded stadium when all the exits are suddenly locked. And here's a strange little detail. Ancient accounts mention that the heat of the Italian summer, combined with the press of sweating bodies, made the ground slick not with blood, but with condensation and mud. In other words, before the swords even did their work, many Romans were slipping, stumbling, and falling under the weight of their comrades. A battle that should have been about bravery and strategy turned into a chaotic wrestling match against gravity and exhaustion. Meanwhile, Hannibal's cavalry had a field day. The Numidians, those lightning-fast horsemen, didn't just scatter the Roman cavalry, they returned to the battlefield to strike from the rear. Imagine realizing that not only are you surrounded, but the enemies you thought were gone are suddenly stabbing you in the back. It's like realizing the villain in a horror movie wasn't dead after all, just waiting for the perfect moment to reappear. As the hours dragged on, the Roman legions collapsed into pockets of resistance. Some groups fought desperately, swinging wildly in the crush, while others simply stood frozen, packed too tightly to move. Roman discipline, usually the backbone of their power, became useless in such conditions. Orders could not be heard over the din. Commanders couldn't even reach their own men through the wall of shields and bodies. Historians still debate whether Hannibal had planned every detail of this encirclement, or whether part of it was just the natural outcome of his cunning formation, meeting Varro's over-advance. Either way, the result was the same. Rome's largest army had become its greatest liability. Now, you may wonder what was Varro doing during all this chaos. Well, here's one of those light-hearted ironies. While Paulus, his more cautious co-consul, reportedly died fighting bravely in the Carthage, Varro managed to escape with a handful of cavalry. He rode hard for Rome, later apologizing for the disaster, but you can bet his popularity rating plummeted faster than a dropped amphora of wine. Some sources claim that when he arrived, the Senate actually praised him not for his performance, but simply because he hadn't given up on Rome itself. Talk about grading on a curve. For the Romans trapped at Cannae, however, there was no mercy. Entire legions vanished in the slaughter. Ancient numbers vary wildly, but estimates range from 50,000 to 70,000 Romans killed in a single day. To put that in perspective, it was like wiping out the population of a small city in less than 24 hours. Even by ancient standards, this was not just a defeat, it was an apocalypse. And yet, amidst this tragedy, we find a few bizarre footnotes. For example, one Roman soldier reportedly tried to dig a hole with his shield and bury himself alive rather than face the inevitable. Another tale claims that when Carthaginian troops stripped Roman corpses, they were astonished by the sheer number of gold ring symbols of Roman senators collected from the dead. Hannibal supposedly poured them into a massive jar and sent them back to Carthage as proof of his victory. Imagine receiving that shipment at home. Dear Carthage, today I send you 20,000 dead senators' rings. Hope you like them. Yours truly, Hannibal. Back in Rome, the news hit like a thunderclap. Families waited in dread for word of loved ones, only to hear that entire legions had been annihilated. The city went into mourning, with black robes worn in the streets and temples crowded with desperate prayers. Rome had suffered defeats before, but never on this scale. Many feared the Republic itself might not survive, but here's the twist. Instead of suing for peace something Hannibal surely hoped for, the Romans doubled down. They declared a national emergency, forbade public displays of grief, and even resorted to grim measures like sacrificing to the gods for deliverance. It was almost as if Rome collectively said, "Oh, you think we're beaten? Nice try. We'll just make this more personal." The irony, of course, is that Hannibal's greatest victory may also have been his greatest mistake. He had destroyed Rome's army, yes, but he had not broken Rome's will. For now, though, imagine the field at Cannae as the sun began to set. Silence finally replaced the clash of swords. The bodies of tens of thousands lay scattered across the plain, and in the midst of that devastation, Hannibal's men stood victorious, while Rome faced the darkest chapter in its history so far. The day after Cannae, the Italian landscape bore scars that would haunt memory for generations. The battlefield stretched silent except for the cries of the wounded and the scavenging of crows. For Hannibal's army, it was a triumph beyond measure. For Rome, it was a nightmare they couldn't wake from. And here's the thing: Hannibal could have marched straight on Rome. The city was reeling, its legions obliterated, and fear gripped the streets. Yet, instead of storming the capital, Hannibal lingered in the south, consolidating allies, gathering supplies, and strengthening his position. Historians still debate whether he missed his greatest chance here. Was it caution, overconfidence, or simply the logistical nightmare of attacking a fortified city without siege engines? Whatever the reason, Rome got a reprieve it desperately needed. Back in Rome, the Senate showed its iron backbone. Citizens were ordered not to give in to despair. Funerals were restricted to avoid public displays of grief, as if the Republic feared sorrow might prove more contagious than plague. And in a strange but telling detail, widows of fallen soldiers were forbidden from openly mourning in the streets. Rome was saying, in essence, yes, we just lost half our army, but please keep it down, we're trying to project strength here. While Hannibal rested, his victory sent shockwaves through the Italian peninsula. Many southern Italian cities and tribes began to reconsider their loyalties. Why stick with Rome when Hannibal had just humiliated them so thoroughly? Some defected, offering support, grain, or even troops to Carthage's general. Yet not all were convinced. Many central Italian allies, particularly the Latin colonies, remained stubbornly loyal to Rome. It was as if they thought, yes, Rome just got smacked across the face, but there's still Rome, and Hannibal, he's just passing through. Here's where things get oddly human. Accounts suggest that in the aftermath, Rome recruited men who had previously been considered unfit for service. Debt slaves, criminals, and even boys barely of age were pressed into new legions. The Republic basically said, "Congratulations, you thought you'd never see combat because of your criminal record. Surprise, you're a Roman soldier now. Please pick up a spear." And because Rome never lacked for a bit of eccentricity, there are even records of human sacrifices performed in the Forum, to Greeks and to Gauls, supposedly buried alive to appease the gods. It sounds shocking, but remember, desperate times often bring out desperate rituals. Whether this act truly helped morale or just terrified the populace further is, of course, debatable. Meanwhile, Hannibal enjoyed support from unexpected corners. One particularly strange detail: after Cannae, some surviving Roman prisoners begged Hannibal to let them ransom themselves back home. Hannibal agreed, but when the delegation reached Rome, the Senate coldly refused. Their reasoning: they didn't want to spend money to free men who had surrendered rather than fought to the death. Brutal, yes, but it reinforced Rome's message: we do not negotiate with defeat. You can almost imagine those poor soldiers standing outside the Senate doors, scratching their heads, muttering, "So we're stuck with Hannibal." Then, speaking of irony, the consul Varro, the very man blamed for marching Rome into disaster, was not punished. Instead, when he returned, the Senate thanked him simply for not abandoning the Republic entirely. It's the kind of faint praise that sounds almost sarcastic. Thank you, Varro, for not making things even worse. Still, despite Rome's resilience, the psychological impact of Cannae lingered like a ghost. Parents whispered it as a cautionary tale to children. Generals studied it as the darkest lesson in military history, and allies weighed it as proof that Rome was not invincible. But Rome did something few expected. Instead of folding, it raised more armies. Grain was rationed, taxes increased, allies squeezed for support, and even the very youngest citizens prepared for war. It was less about military genius at this stage, and more about sheer stubbornness. Rome was like that one friend who refuses to leave the party even after the music stops, the lights turn on, and the host starts washing dishes. Historians have long wondered, why didn't Hannibal press harder? Why didn't he march directly on the city and end the Republic while it was vulnerable? Some argue he lacked siege equipment. Others say he hoped to draw Rome's allies away, starving the city out rather than storming it. And then there's the school of thought that says Hannibal, ever the strategist, was playing the long game but underestimated just how long Rome was willing to play back. For now, Hannibal's soldiers feasted, drank, and celebrated. They had faced Rome at its strongest and delivered a crushing blow. To them, it must have seemed the war was already won. But history, as we know, has a way of dragging out stories long past their expected endings. As night fell over the Italian countryside, the fires of Hannibal's camp burned brightly. His men laughed, sang, and boasted about their great victory. Meanwhile, in Rome, candles burned late in the Senate halls, shadows stretching across the marble walls as the Republic plotted its survival. The war was far from over. In fact, it was only about to get more complicated. If the Battle of Cannae was Hannibal's masterpiece, then the years after were his great test of patience. Picture the Carthaginian general with Italy sprawled before him like a banquet table, juicy cities to conquer, fertile lands to raid, allies ripe for the picking. And yet, no matter how many invitations he sent out, some guests refused to leave Rome's side. In the south, Hannibal found willing friends. Capua, a wealthy city famed for its luxury and indulgence, defected from Rome and welcomed Hannibal's army like conquering heroes. Imagine being a soldier who had just crawled out of the dust and blood of Cannae, only to be ushered into Capua's baths, feasts, and games. One Roman historian even sniped that Hannibal's men were weakened by luxury after their stay, which is ancient historians speak for. They partied a little too hard. But honestly, can you blame them? After years of marching and fighting, a glass of wine and a warm bath probably sounded like heaven. Rome, of course, did not take kindly to this betrayal. They laid siege to Capua, determined to drag it back into line. The citizens begged Hannibal to come save them, and he tried, but each attempt to lift the siege fizzled out. Eventually, Capua fell, and its leaders met a predictably grim fate. Strange detail here. Roman soldiers supposedly forced some of the captured Capuans to fight as gladiators in the very arena their city had once built for games. That's what you call poetic punishment. Meanwhile, in other parts of Italy, Hannibal's fortunes were mixed. Some tribes in Apulia and Samnium flocked to his banner, eager to kick Rome while it was down. But the Latin colonies, the backbone of Rome's alliance network, remained infuriatingly loyal. They continued to send troops, grain, and taxes to Rome, even as Hannibal camped practically on their doorsteps. It's as if they were saying, "We've seen Rome get beat before, and they always come back angrier." Speaking of anger, the Roman Senate turned rage into policy. Instead of suing for peace, they doubled down. New armies were raised at a pace that would exhaust even a modern draft board. Rome adopted a strategy later known as the Fabian strategy, named after Fabius Maximus, the cautious general who advocated avoiding big battles and instead harassing Hannibal's supply lines. It was less glorious war and more annoy your opponent until they run out of food. Not glamorous, but surprisingly effective. And here's where it gets a little odd. During this period, Rome even resorted to melting down sacred treasures from temples to fund their endless war effort. Imagine being a devout Roman, watching your god's golden offerings turned into coins, and being told, "Don't worry, Jupiter won't mind, it's for the war." Historians still debate whether this was an act of desperation or a show of unity between religion and state. Either way, it kept the legions fed and armed. Hannibal, meanwhile, tried to spark revolts further afield. He sent envoys to the Greek cities of southern Italy, to Sicily, and even to Macedonia, hoping to stretch Rome thin. For a while, it worked. Macedonia's king Philip V actually signed an alliance with Hannibal, though it turned into more of a nuisance for Rome than a decisive blow. Still, it was proof that Hannibal's name carried weight far beyond the Italian hills. But let's pause here for one of those delightful side notes. Somewhere during these campaigns, sources tell us that Hannibal's army included elephants. Still, apparently, a few had survived the Alpine crossing and years of campaigning. Can you imagine being a farmer in Campania, waking up to find an elephant rummaging through your vineyard? It's the kind of problem you definitely don't call the local magistrate for Rome. Slowly but surely, adapted. They stopped giving Hannibal the big set-piece battles he loved. Instead, they nipped at his heels, cut off reinforcements, and wore him down. It was like trying to fight Fogel could never land a decisive blow. But you could smother it with persistence. And yet, Hannibal was still dangerous. His cavalry roamed Italy like wolves, striking wherever they pleased. Farmers abandoned their fields, and entire regions starved because no one dared plant crops. Roman citizens took to storing grain in temples, hoping the gods would protect it from Carthaginian raids. Meanwhile, children grew up with nightmares of Hannibal himself. Roman mothers famously warned misbehaving kids, "Hannibal is at the gates," a phrase that became so common it turned into a proverb. Through it all, the psychological tug-of-war between Rome and Hannibal grew stronger. Each city that defected to Hannibal was a blow to Rome's pride. Each one that remained loyal was proof that the Republic's roots ran deeper than anyone realized. And each season that passed without a final victory made Hannibal's position just a little shakier. Historians still argue about whether Hannibal's Italian strategy was genius or folly. Was he waiting for Rome to collapse under its own stubbornness? Or did he miscalculate the resilience of a city that had already crawled back from disasters before? Whatever the case, the middle years of the war became a grinding contest of willpower. And make no mistake, Rome's willpower was legendary. The Republic might lose battles, legions, even allies, but it refused to lose the war. As one modern historian put it, Rome did not fight well, but Rome fought forever. For now, Hannibal remained a dark storm cloud over Italy, unpredictable and menacing, but in the distance, the storm was beginning to shift. Other theaters of war, Sicily, Spain, and eventually Africa would soon demand Rome's and Carthage's full attention. The stage was set for an even greater clash. But before we get there, Hannibal still had years of maneuvering left in Italy. By the time a decade of war had dragged across Italy, both Rome and Hannibal were feeling the weight of their choices. Hannibal, ever the master of battlefield trickery, now faced a war of patience, and patience was not the Carthaginian army's strongest suit. His bold strategy of prying Italy apart had stalled. Rome refused to crack, and Hannibal found himself playing an endless game of cat and mouse. Let's be clear, this was not the flashy kind of war. No grand double envelopment, like at Cannae, no elephants scaling alpine cliffs. Instead, it was marches, countermarches, ambushes, and supply raids. Imagine following Hannibal's army. One day you're in Apulia, the next in Campania, then suddenly trudging through the swampy lowlands near the Arno River. By the way, those swamps were notorious for mosquitoes. Soldiers weren't just dodging javelins, they were swatting insects that carried fevers. Some chroniclers claim even Hannibal himself lost an eye from an infection picked up during those marches. If true, it's a grim reminder that generals suffer the mud and muck to dot Rome. Meanwhile, learned to play the long game. With the Fabian strategy in full swing, Roman generals avoided direct battle, shadowing Hannibal's movements and picking off stragglers. Fabius Maximus, nicknamed the Delayer, became something of a national symbol. The joke in Rome was that he won battles by not fighting them. You can imagine impatient young soldiers groaning every time Fabius ordered another withdrawal. Great, another day of walking backwards, very heroic. But in the long run, this stubborn caution worked. That doesn't mean every Roman general was so cautious. Take Marcus Claudius Marcellus, nicknamed the Sword of Rome. If Fabius was the shield, Marcellus was the one swinging for glory. He led daring raids against Hannibal's forces, striking when the Carthaginian wasn't expecting it. Once, he even managed to wound Hannibal during a skirmish, though Hannibal survived, of course. Still, it showed Rome wasn't content to cower forever. Meanwhile, Rome's alliances continued to hold surprisingly firm. Latin colonies poured out men and money to keep the war effort alive. But cracks were forming in other places. In Sicily, Carthage stirred rebellion, and in Spain, Hannibal's brothers were fighting their own campaigns against Roman forces. It was turning into a truly global conflict for the ancient world. Italy, Spain, Greece, Sicily, and eventually, Africa itself. At times, it must have seemed less like a duel between two men, and more like a continental tug-of-war. Odd detail here. One account says, Hannibal's men sometimes disguised themselves as local shepherds to sneak through enemy territory. Picture a battle-hardened Carthaginian cavalryman, awkwardly wrapped in a wool cloak, holding a shepherd's staff, hoping nobody notices the massive warhorse tethered nearby. It sounds almost comedic, but it shows the level of improvisation required. In this grinding phase of the war, back in Rome, daily life was a constant reminder of Hannibal's shadow. The Senate debated endlessly, grain shortages hit the markets, and even traditional festivals sometimes turned into patriotic rallies. Priests scoured the skies for omens, interpreting every eclipse and lightning strike as a message from the gods about the war. Historians still debate whether these omens were genuine observations or convenient political theater. But either way, the Romans clung to them for reassurance. The psychological toll was immense. Remember the old line Roman mothers used to scare children, "Hannibal is at the gates." By now, it wasn't just a warning. At least once, Hannibal literally marched within a few miles of Rome itself. In 211 BCE, after failing to save Capua, Hannibal boldly camped outside the Eternal City, daring Rome to come out and fight. Panic spread in the streets, but the Senate refused to take the bait. Instead of risking another Cannae, Rome held firm. Behind its walls, Hannibal, finding no easy victory, eventually pulled back. The message was clear: Rome would not be intimidated into surrender. And yet, Hannibal remained a constant thorn. His cavalry continued to raid the countryside, forcing Roman farmers to abandon their fields. The Republic's economy strained under the burden of endless armies and devastated agriculture. Strange as it sounds, some Roman estates turned to raising goats instead of crops during this period, since goats could survive where farmland had been ruined by war. Imagine telling a senator that your grand contribution to the war effort was goat cheese. Humor aside, the war dragged on. Neither side could land the knockout punch. Carthage, far away, often failed to send Hannibal the reinforcements he begged for. Rome, stretched thin, wondered how long its citizens could endure the endless drafts. It was a stalemate, but not a comfortable one. Historians still debate whether Hannibal's choice not to march directly on Rome after Cannae was his great mistake. Could he have ended the war right there? Or would the walls and stubbornness of the city have broken him just as surely as later campaigns did? No one can say for sure, but the question lingers like a ghost over this entire chapter of history. For now, Hannibal prowled Italy, undefeated but also unvictorious. Rome, bruised and bloodied, refused to give in. It was a clash not just of armies, but of wills, and as the years wore on, the balance of momentum began, ever so slowly, to tilt. By the early 210s BCE, Rome realized something crucial. Chasing Hannibal around Italy was like trying to swat a particularly stubborn mosquito. You could wave your arms, jump around the room, even light a candle in desperation, but the buzzing menace just kept circling. Rome needed a new plan, and so, the Republic began to think bigger. If Hannibal would not leave Italy, Rome would take the war elsewhere. Spain became the first real testing ground. Remember, Hannibal hadn't just strolled across the Alps out of nowhere. He came from a Carthaginian power base in Iberia, rich in silver mines and soldiers. Rome understood that if they could cut off Spain, Hannibal's lifeline of reinforcements and resources would dry up. Enter the Scipio family, who were basically the Roman version of a multi-generational superhero franchise. Gnaeus and Publius, Scipio brothers, commanders and annoyingly ambitious men, led Roman forces into Iberia. At first, things looked promising. They won battles, rallied local allies, and even managed to capture parts of the coast. But Carthaginian resilience was nothing to scoff at. In 211 BCE, both brothers were killed in separate engagements, leaving Roman forces in Spain scattered. It could have been a disaster, but instead it set the stage for one of Rome's greatest comebacks. Because this is where a new player entered the game. Publius Cornelius Scipio, better known to history as Scipio Africanus. Yes, the same man, who would one day face Hannibal himself. At just 25 years old, he was given command in Spain. A shocking promotion considering Roman tradition usually favored older, more seasoned generals. You can almost hear the grumbling in the Senate chambers. What's next? Letting toddlers sit on the consul's chair? But Scipio turned out to be anything but childish. Scipio's campaigns in Spain showcased a flair for daring maneuvers that rivaled Hannibal's own. His most famous coup came at New Carthage, modern Cartagena, the Carthaginian capital in Iberia. In 209 BCE, Scipio launched a lightning strike, seizing the city in a matter of days. He used local fishermen's knowledge of the tides to sneak troops across shallow lagoons, catching the defenders completely off guard. It was part genius, part luck, and entirely humiliating for Carthage. Imagine being the governor of New Carthage. One morning you wake up confident, sipping wine on the ramparts, and by evening, your city is flying Roman banners. Meanwhile, back in Italy, Hannibal still danced circles around Roman generals. He scored minor victories, but his momentum was slipping. Allies who had once rushed to his side like Capua were gradually brought back under Roman control. In fact, Capua's punishment after its eventual surrender was so severe that Roman schoolchildren were still told about it generations later as a cautionary tale. Don't betray the Republic, or you'll end up like Capua. Probably not the most cheerful bedtime story for Roman kids. An odd note here. Some sources claim Hannibal's army resorted to bartering spoils of war for basic goods, like salt and grain, in the middle of markets while locals nervously watched. Imagine strolling to buy a loaf of bread and bumping into a grizzled Carthaginian soldier offering you a captured Roman helmet in exchange for a sack of onions. That's less battlefield glory and more medieval flea market. Rome also began to flex its naval power again. After losing fleets early in the war, the Romans rebuilt, using their control of Sicily as a launching pad. Carthaginian shipping lanes were harassed, weakening their ability to send aid to Hannibal. Sicily itself became a fierce battleground, with Syracuse famously switching sides to Carthage only to face a brutal Roman siege. It was during this siege that the genius inventor Archimedes supposedly built war machines to defend the city, giant claws to capsize ships, mirrors to set them on fire. Whether or not the mirror trick actually worked, the idea of death rays certainly gave Syracuse some extra flair in the history books. Of course, the siege ended with Syracuse falling in 212 BCE, and tragically, Archimedes was killed despite Roman orders to spare him. It's one of those moments where history takes a deep sigh, a brilliant mind lost to the chaos of war. Hannibal, far away in southern Italy, could do nothing to help. By the end of this phase, Rome had begun to claw back the initiative. Spain was gradually tipping in their favor, Sicily was under control, and Carthage's hopes of reinforcing Hannibal were growing dim. The once terrifying shadow of Cannae seemed a little less dark, and yet Hannibal was still there, still undefeated, in a pitched battle, still prowling Italian fields, still daring the Republic to come face him. Historians still debate whether this phase was Rome's clever shift in strategy, or Carthage's failure to support their greatest general. Maybe it was both. But what's clear is that the war was no longer a one-man show. A larger stage was being set, and young Scipio was stepping into the spotlight. One Roman senator, probably with a grin, might have muttered, "At last, Hannibal isn't the only genius in the room." Though, given Roman politics, it's just as likely someone muttered, "Why does this Scipio kid get all the credit while my cousin is stuck in Sicily herding goats?" Either way, the tides of war were shifting, slowly, relentlessly, inevitably. By the time the war crept into the later 200s BCE, Rome had learned the golden rule of survival. If you can't knock Hannibal down in Italy, hit him everywhere else until he starts to wobble. Spain had already begun to tip into Roman hands under young Scipio's brilliance, but the real question was, could this energetic commander hold Iberia long enough to cut off Hannibal completely? The answer turned out to be yes, and with flair. Scipio didn't just march around like a standard Roman general. He studied Hannibal's playbook and scribbled his own bold notes in the margins. He mixed Roman discipline with Carthaginian-style deception, winning over Iberian tribes not just with sword and shield but with charm. Ancient writers gushed that Scipio looked like a god among men, glowing in armor, with a charisma that could win an election even in today's social media age. Some even claimed he believed in his own divine destiny. Whether or not he staged perfect lighting for dramatic entrances, the locals adored him, and Iberia steadily slipped out of Carthaginian control. Meanwhile, in Italy, Hannibal found himself increasingly isolated. His allies shrank, Roman garrisons grew bolder, and reinforcements never arrived in the numbers he needed. Carthage seemed to treat him like the cousin you brag about at family dinners but never send money to when he actually needs it. His brother, Hasdrubal, tried to cross the Alps in 207 BCE with reinforcements, But his army was ambushed and crushed at the Meteorus River. Hasdrubal was killed, and in one of the darkest moments of ancient psychological warfare, his head was tossed into Hannibal's camp. Brutal, yes, but also very Roman in its messaging. Don't expect help, you're on your own. This moment marked a turning point. Hannibal, once terrifying, now looked trapped. He retreated further south into the heel of Italy, clinging to Tarentum and Bruttium, his presence more symbolic than strategic. He was still dangerous, but Rome had grown confident enough to look beyond its own borders. For the first time in years, the Senate allowed itself to dream about not just survival, but victory. And that victory, they decided, would come not in Italy, but in Africa itself. This was a bold shift. Up to now, Carthage had largely kept its homeland untouched, while Rome bled on its own soil. But with Iberia falling under Scipio's command, and Sicily secured, Rome began preparing for the unthinkable, carrying the war directly to Carthage's doorstep. Here, Scipio's rise reached new heights. By 205 BCE, still in his early 30s, he was elected consul. The Senate debated fiercely about whether to trust him with an invasion of Africa. Some conservative senators fretted, muttering things like, "He's too young, he's too flashy, and he probably conditions his hair with imported Spanish olive oil." Others argued, Rome had no choice. If anyone could outwit Hannibal, it was Scipio. Eventually, the Senate relented, though not without attaching the usual Roman conditions, designed to sound supportive while being mildly insulting. He was granted command, but had to raise much of his army himself. Luckily for Scipio, veterans who had served under him in Spain flocked to his banner. They trusted him. He had that rare thing, loyalty built not on fear, but on admiration. Before setting sail, Scipio trained his troops in Sicily, drilling them relentlessly, while also experimenting with new tactics. He blended Roman legionary discipline with Iberian cavalry techniques, creating a hybrid force that was flexible, fast, and terrifyingly effective. One odd note, some ancient sources mention him consulting with soothsayers and even visiting sacred groves for divine inspiration. Whether this was genuine faith or just good PR, it only strengthened his mystique. Meanwhile, Hannibal remained in Italy, watching as the balance of the war shifted beneath his feet. Carthage finally realized the danger and scrambled to defend Africa. Generals like Hasdrubal, Gisco, and the Numidian king Sifox were called upon to resist the Roman invasion. Numidian cavalry, famous for their speed and skirmishing skill, became the decisive wild card. Control of these horsemen could tilt the entire balance of the African campaign. By 204 BCE, Scipio landed in Africa. The ground shook at least as Rome's war machine now threatened Carthage directly. For the first time in the Second Punic War, the hunter had become the hunted. Carthage scrambled to negotiate alliances, patch together armies, and stall for time. But the looming reality was inescapable. This conflict was barreling toward its climax, and sooner or later, Hannibal himself would be summoned home. Historians still debate whether Carthage should have reinforced Hannibal instead of recalling him. Was it wiser to let him finish the job in Italy? Or did Africa's danger demand his return? Either way, by failing to choose decisively, Carthage found itself in the worst possible position, fighting Rome at home while its greatest general waited thousands of miles away. At this stage, Rome had clawed its way back from humiliation at Cannae to a position of strength. The Republic, once gasping for survival, was now poised to deliver the knockout blow. And Scipio, the once untested boy general, was sharpening his sword for the final act. The stage was set for Africa. But before the curtain rose on the last showdown, Hannibal still had one last card to play, and Rome knew it. When Scipio set foot on African soil in 204 BCE, it wasn't just the start of another Roman campaign, it was a statement: "We've bled enough, now it's your turn." For the first time in the war, Roman banners flapped in the North African wind, casting long shadows across the plains near Carthage. Scipio had chosen his landing site carefully, not too far from Utica, a major port. He wanted a foothold close enough to strike at Carthage's heart, but also easy to supply. His army wasn't massive by Roman standards, about 30,000 men, but it was battle-hardened, tested in Spain and Sicily, and drilled to perfection. Think of it like a finely tuned machine, with gears oiled by years of experience and discipline. Carthage, caught off guard, scrambled to throw together a defense. They leaned heavily on their allies, especially the Numidian king Cephox, whose cavalry had a reputation for being the fastest in the ancient world. These riders weren't armored tanks like Roman legionaries. They were lightly equipped, darting in and out like mosquitoes with spears. If used well, they could shred a slower Roman army before it even got close to battle. The first encounters were messy. Scipio faced not just Carthaginian forces, but also Cephax's warriors, creating a two-front nightmare. At one point, Scipio even considered negotiations, sending envoys to Carthage and Cephox. This wasn't cowardice, it was tactical theater. He needed time to assess his enemies and probe for weaknesses. But here's where the story takes a strange twist. While diplomacy sputtered, Scipio's men pulled off one of the boldest tricks of the entire war. At night, under the cover of darkness, they attacked the joint Carthaginian-Numidian camp with fire. Tents went up in flames, panic spread like a virus, and soldiers trampled each other trying to escape. In the chaos, Scipio's troops cut down thousands. It was less of a battle and more of a fiery demolition. The Carthaginian coalition suffered a crushing blow before it had even properly begun. Still, Africa wasn't won overnight. Cephox, slippery as ever, rallied more forces, while Carthage sent envoys running in every direction, desperate for allies. Some accounts even claim Carthaginian commanders sacrificed animals in bizarre rituals, hoping to summon divine favor. Whether those gods listened or not, the reality was grim. Scipio's army kept pushing forward, capturing towns, burning supplies, and weakening Carthage's grip on its own homeland. At this stage, one of the most important switches flipped. The Numidian leadership shifted. Cephax's rival Massinissa defected to Rome. This was huge. Massinissa was ambitious, ruthless, and brilliant, and he commanded cavalry every bit as skilled as Cephax's. Suddenly, Scipio didn't just neutralize Carthage's horsemen, he gained the best cavalry ally Rome could have dreamed of. Meanwhile, back in Italy, Hannibal still lingered. He knew the war's tides were changing, but Carthage hesitated to recall him. Historians still debate whether this delay sealed Carthage's fate. Imagine being Hannibal, trapped in southern Italy, watching your empire crumble from across the sea, while your homeland dithers over strategy. It must have been maddening. Eventually, Carthage had no choice. With Scipio storming through Africa and Massinissa nipping at their flanks, the Senate sent word: Hannibal must return. After 16 years in Italy, 16 years of brilliance, suffering, and near victory, packed up his army for the long journey home. His departure from Italy carried an air of tragedy. Many of his soldiers had grown old fighting there, their lives bound to a land that had never welcomed them. Some sources say Italian allies wept at his leaving, knowing their chance to shake off Rome had vanished. Hannibal himself, the man who had marched elephants over the Alps, who had destroyed Roman legions in legendary battles, was leaving without achieving the one goal he had set out for: the destruction of Rome. Back in Africa, Scipio tightened the noose. He and Massinissa pursued Cephox relentlessly, defeating him and capturing him alive. The once proud king who had terrified Roman scouts ended up a prisoner, paraded before the army as proof of Scipio's genius. Carthage was running out of cards to play. And so, the stage was set for the final act. Two legends, Scipio and Hannibal, were now destined to meet face to face on African soil. It was as though the entire war had been a build-up to this one moment. Rome versus Carthage, genius versus genius, destiny against destiny. But before that clash, both sides would maneuver, negotiate, and prepare for a showdown that would decide not just the war but the fate of the Mediterranean world. And somewhere, in the middle of all this chaos, someone probably muttered the timeless line: "This seemed like a good idea yesterday." When Hannibal finally set foot back in Africa in 203 BCE, it felt like history itself holding its breath. For more than 15 years, his shadow had loomed over Italy's victories, carved into Roman memory like scars. And now, after so long, he was home again. The irony was brutal. He returned not as a conqueror, but as Carthage's last desperate hope. Carthage greeted him like a prodigal son. Crowds lined the streets, elders wept with relief, and young men who had grown up hearing tales of Cannae now looked upon the man himself, their living legend. But the welcome was mixed with fear. Everyone knew the truth. Hannibal had been recalled not in triumph, but because Carthage was cornered. Scipio was in their backyard, Massinica's cavalry roamed free, and allies were vanishing. Carthage needed a miracle, and Hannibal was the only man they thought capable of delivering it. Yet Hannibal wasn't the same man who had crossed the Alps with elephants. Years of endless war had worn him down. His hair was streaked with grey. His army was no longer the hardened veterans of Trebia and Trasimene, but a patchwork of recruits, survivors, and mercenaries. Still, his mind remained sharp, his presence commanding. Even in weariness, Hannibal radiated that rare aura that could convince men to fight when logic told them to flee. The first step wasn't battle, but negotiation. Carthage, eager to avoid total destruction, sent envoys to Scipio. Hannibal himself eventually met the Roman commander face to face. Imagine the scene: two of the greatest generals of the ancient world, sitting across from each other, each knowing the other's genius, each aware that history would remember whichever one prevailed. The accounts of their conversation differ, but the essence is clear. Hannibal, pragmatic to the end, offered terms. Carthage was willing to surrender much its foreign territories, its navy, its wealth in exchange for survival. Scipio listened politely, but he had come too far, risked too much, to accept anything less than total submission. For Rome, this wasn't just about ending a war. It was about ensuring Carthage would never again rise as a threat. One strange detail from these talks stands out. Some sources claim Hannibal tried to charm Scipio with stories of great leaders of the past, weighing who had been the greatest: Alexander, Pyrrhus, or perhaps himself. Whether true or apocryphal, it's the kind of conversation only two men, at the pinnacle of their craft, could indulge in, even with armies waiting outside their tents. Historians still debate whether this exchange ever really happened, or if it was simply a later writer's attempt to dramatize their rivalry. When talks broke down, Hannibal returned to his army. His troops, roughly 40,000 men, were brave, but mismatched Carthaginian citizens, mercenaries from across Africa, and some survivors from Italy. He did his best to mold them into a fighting force, drilling them, encouraging them, even hiding his doubts behind a mask of confidence. Scipio, meanwhile, had perhaps 30,000 men, but a crucial advantage: Massinica's Numidian cavalry. Speed, maneuverability, discipline. The ingredients that had so often tilted battles in Hannibal's favor were now on Rome's side. And yet, despite the odds, the sense of anticipation was electric. Everyone knew what was coming. This wasn't just another skirmish. This would be the battle to end the Second Punic War. Hannibal, the man who had nearly brought Rome to her knees, against Scipio, the rising star who had turned Rome's fortunes around. Two commanders, each at the height of strategic genius, preparing to gamble everything on one clash. In the Carthaginian camp, soldiers sharpened their swords by firelight, whispering of destiny and doom. In the Roman camp, veterans told stories of past disasters: Trebia, Trasimene, Cannae, but swore that tomorrow would be different. The ground between them, near the town of Zama, would soon soak in the outcome of decades of conflict. And somewhere, as the night stretched on, a soldier probably muttered, "Why couldn't we just settle this with a coin toss?" By dawn, there was no turning back. Hannibal's elephants were lined up, their tusks sharpened, their hides painted with war colors. Scipio's men braced, shields locked, spears steady. Massinica's cavalry waited like wolves, eager to pounce. The war, the suffering, the endless years of struggle, all of it was about to be decided in one final battle. The morning sun rose over the plains of Zama, like a spotlight on the final act of a very long play. For nearly 2 decades, Rome and Carthage had fought across seas, mountains, and continents, and now everything came down to this. You could almost hear history clearing its throat. Hannibal arranged his army carefully, though he knew he was gambling with a weak hand. In the front line he placed his war elephants, seti, towering beasts, tusks capped with iron, painted in bright colors meant to terrify. Behind them came a first wave of mercenaries from all corners of Africa, Gauls with heavy swords, Ligurians with javelins, and Balearic slingers ready to rain stones. Behind those stood Carthaginian citizens themselves, grim and nervous. Finally, in the last line, Hannibal placed his most reliable troops, veterans from his long campaigns in Italy. These were the men who had stood with him at Cannae, the survivors of countless battles, the steel core of his army. Scipio, on the other hand, arranged his forces with methodical precision. Roman infantry formed the backbone as always, but the real twist came in how he positioned them. Instead of packing his men shoulder to shoulder, Scipio left open lanes gaps running straight through his lines. To anyone unfamiliar with Roman discipline, it looked like a mistake, but it was a trap, carefully set for Hannibal's elephants. And then, with a blare of horns and the shouts of mahouts, the elephants charged. Dust rose, ground shook, soldiers prayed under their breath. But instead of smashing through the Roman ranks, the elephants barreled straight into those open lanes. Trumpets sounded as Roman soldiers banged weapons against shields, shouting to spook the animals. Some elephants panicked and ran back, trampling Hannibal's own mercenaries. Others were corralled aside and neutralized. Scipio's gamble had worked. The thunderous beasts that once symbolized Carthaginian terror were turned into chaos machines. Meanwhile, the first clash of infantry came hard and fast. Hannibal's mercenaries threw themselves at the Roman lines. Fierce and desperate, sling stones cracked helmets, swords clanged against shields. For a moment, the field was a mess of shouting and blood and dust. The mercenaries fought savagely, but they were poorly coordinated. When they faltered, Hannibal ordered the second-line Carthaginian citizens forward. Here, things got awkward. The mercenaries, still half retreating, collided with the advancing citizens, causing confusion and anger. Some even turned their weapons on each other in the melee. Talk about bad teamwork. Scipio pressed his advantage, pushing steadily forward. His Roman infantry was disciplined, methodical, the kind of soldiers who could win not with flair but with sheer stubbornness. But Hannibal was not out of tricks. He signaled his veterans, the men he had kept in reserve. These were hardened warriors, men who had lived through Cannae, who had marched Italy's roads, who had faced down the best Rome could throw at them. They stepped into the fight with grim determination. And suddenly the battle shifted. The Romans found themselves checked, their advance slowed, their lines shaken. Hannibal's veterans fought with a skill and ferocity that forced Scipio to dig deep. For a moment, just a moment, it seemed as if the old Hannibal might pull off one last miracle. But Scipio had one final card. And it wasn't on the ground, it was in the saddle. Massinius's Numidian cavalry, joined with Roman horsemen, had swept the flanks earlier in the day. Now, after routing Carthage's cavalry, they returned. Dust clouds rose as thousands of horsemen charged into Hannibal's rear. His veterans, already locked in a brutal struggle, suddenly found themselves attacked from behind. That was the breaking point. Even the most battle-hardened warriors cannot fight on two fronts forever. The Carthaginian lines buckled, then collapsed. What had begun as Hannibal's last stand dissolved into rout and ruin. Some strange details linger in ancient accounts. One writer swears that a group of elephants, confused and terrified, spent half the battle circling aimlessly, trumpeting at nothing, as if they were as uncertain about the outcome as the soldiers. Historians still debate whether Hannibal might have won had his elephants broken the Romans, as they had so many enemies before. But what-ifs don't win wars. Discipline, timing, and luck do. As the battle ended, Scipio stood victorious, his gamble rewarded, his reputation sealed. Hannibal, seeing the carnage, withdrew with as much dignity as he could muster. He had not been captured, but the war was effectively over. Carthage had lost. Rome, the stubborn city that had nearly been crushed at Cannae, now stood supreme. And Scipio earned a new name, Africanus, for the land where he had defeated Carthage's greatest son. And somewhere in the dust and wreckage of Zama, a soldier probably muttered, "So, does this mean we can finally go home now?" The aftermath of Zama was not a scene of triumphal parades, at least not immediately. It was more like a very tense negotiation where one side had a big sword on the table, and the other had, well, not much. Carthage, once a proud naval empire, had been reduced to a city begging for mercy. The streets were heavy with silence, broken only by the cries of the wounded filtering in from the battlefield. People knew the war was lost, and now the question was, how much would Rome take? The Carthaginian Senate, weary from years of devastation, sent envoys to Scipio. Their offer was simple: peace at any cost. They knew Rome could march on their city and destroy it outright. But perhaps Scipio, a man known for his temperance, would settle for terms that left Carthage alive. Hannibal himself, the man who had carried their hopes across mountains and fields, was summoned to be part of the delegation. That had to feel awkward, like asking the guy who nearly conquered Rome to now help you negotiate surrender. Scipio listened, calm and composed, though surely savoring the irony. The terms he laid out were crushing. Carthage would surrender its entire fleet, save for just 10 ships, sem ships, from a navy that had once dominated the Mediterranean. Every war elephant, every symbol of terror, had to be handed over. They would pay an enormous indemnity, silver piled into Roman coffers for 50 years to come. And perhaps the harshest blow, Carthage could not wage war, ever again, without Roman permission. In other words, Rome had not just won, it had placed Carthage in shackles. Hannibal, ever the realist, advised acceptance. He stood in the Carthaginian assembly and reportedly told them that Rome would not be merciful if they resisted further. Coming from a man who had once stood at the gates of Rome itself, those words carried weight. Yet, some hotheads in the council wanted to keep fighting. One elder is said to have shouted that they should burn their own city before bowing to Roman rule. But, of course, courage in speeches rarely matches courage in reality. The majority voted for peace. Strange details filter through history. Some sources mention Carthaginian families weeping as they saw their beloved ships dragged out of the harbor and burned in front of them. Imagine watching not just war machines, but also generations of seafaring pride, reduced to smoke and ashes. Others claim children asked their parents why the elephants were being led away, not knowing that their city would never see such beasts again. Historians still debate whether Scipio spared Carthage out of pragmatism. Rome wasn't yet ready to govern all of North Africa or out of personal restraint. After all, not every Roman leader in history was so merciful. For Rome, it was a moment of unmatched triumph. They had endured humiliation, near destruction, and countless setbacks. Yet here they stood, masters of the Mediterranean, their bitter rival defanged. For Carthage, it was survival, but survival in chains. The city still bustled with trade and culture, but it was a shadow of its former self. And what of Hannibal? He returned not as the conquering hero his people had once dreamed of, but as the man who had negotiated their surrender. Still, he commanded respect after all. Who else could claim to have nearly toppled Rome and lived to tell the tale? With Carthage disarmed and humiliated, the real challenge now was political survival. Hannibal, ever clever, would soon reinvent himself not as a general, but as a statesman. But that, of course, is a story for the next chapter. For the average Roman soldier packing up after Zama, the victory was sweet, but also practical. It meant fewer elephants to worry about trampling them in their sleep, fewer weeks of hard rations, and the sweet prospect of marching home. One legionary might have looked at Scipio and thought, "This guy better get us a good parade when we get back." The Second Punic War, that massive struggle that had stretched from Spain to Italy to Africa, was finally over. And yet, the embers of rivalry between Rome and Carthage still glowed faintly, waiting for a time when Rome would fan them into flames again. Hannibal the warrior had marched across rivers, mountains, and empires, but Hannibal the politician, that was a whole new battlefield. When he returned to Carthage after Zama, he didn't fade into obscurity, as some defeated generals did. Instead, he stepped into the very heart of civic life. Carthage, stripped of her navy and elephants, still needed leadership, and Hannibal, for all his failures, remained the most capable man in the city. And so, with that same mix of brilliance and stubbornness, he became a statesman. Carthage's government was notoriously corrupt at the time. Senators lined their own pockets, merchants twisted laws, and tax collectors bled the people dry. If war had not already drained the city, mismanagement surely would. Hannibal, who had spent years commanding armies on the march, recognized inefficiency. When he saw it, he swept into office like a man on a mission. Taxes were restructured to make them fairer, elites were forced to contribute more, and the city's debts began to shrink. Ordinary citizens, farmers, artisans, dockworkers, actually felt a glimmer of hope. Hannibal, of all people, was cleaning house. Of course, reformers rarely make friends among the rich. Carthage's elite whispered against him, frustrated that their cozy financial games were being exposed. Some accused him of being too harsh, too authoritarian, but Hannibal pressed on, wielding civic authority with the same precision he once used to arrange cavalry. He even kept meticulous records of state finances, ensuring Rome's crushing indemnity payments were met on time. Imagine the irony. Hannibal, the man who had once vowed to destroy Rome, now making sure Rome received its silver on schedule. Yet there were stranger details, too. Some say Hannibal walked through the Carthaginian markets without guards, chatting with farmers about crop yields and debating with fishmongers about prices. Others claim he once joked that running a city was more exhausting than running an army, because at least soldiers march in straight lines. Historians still debate whether this version of Hannibal, open, approachable, almost humorous, was genuine or a carefully cultivated act to win public trust. But while the common people admired him, enemies gathered in the shadows. Carthage's wealthy elites began to fear not just his reforms, but also his lingering influence over the masses. A general who had crossed the Alps with elephants and terrified Rome was dangerous enough. A general who also knew how to win over shopkeepers and scribes was downright terrifying. And if that wasn't enough, Rome itself kept a suspicious eye on him. Scipio might have respected Hannibal, but the Roman Senate never forgot the destruction he had brought upon Italy. One Roman senator is said to have remarked, "As long as Hannibal lives, Rome will never sleep easy," and that was true. Even in defeat, Hannibal's name carried weight. Parents still told stories of him to scare children into obedience. Veterans still remembered the nightmares of facing his troops. The Romans worried he might rise again, perhaps leading some new coalition of states against them. Meanwhile, Carthage's recovery under his reforms began to show. Trade routes flourished, the markets grew livelier, and the city's coffers slowly filled again. Ironically, Hannibal's efficiency in managing finances only made Rome more nervous if Carthage could pay off its indemnities so quickly. What was to stop it from rearming once the debt was gone? The stage was set for tension. Hannibal had turned from warrior to statesman, but the walls were closing in. Carthaginian elites wanted him gone, and Roman envoys were whispering about his dangerous influence. The man who had outwitted legions now found himself ensnared in politics, where enemies struck not with swords, but with schemes. For the ordinary citizen of Carthage, though life in those years was oddly stable, the city bustled again, with dockworkers unloading goods from distant ports and markets echoing with shouts of vendors. Children ran through the streets without the shadow of war looming overhead. A farmer might have thought, maybe this Hannibal fellow should have been in charge all along. Of course, farmers rarely get to decide the fate of generals. Hannibal could outmaneuver legions, predict cavalry charges, and sense ambushes before they happened, but politics, that was a battlefield even he couldn't always control. As Carthage prospered under his reforms, enemies multiplied like weeds. Rome, in particular, grew restless. They had demanded tribute from Carthage, and Hannibal was paying it off faster than expected, which was both efficient and terrifying. A stronger Carthage, even one without elephants, was not what Rome wanted. So Rome sent envoys whispering into the ears of Carthage's senators, "Hannibal is dangerous. If you truly value peace, remove him." And the Carthaginian elite, many of whom resented him already for cutting into their fortunes, nodded eagerly. They were only too happy to trade a national hero for personal comfort. Hannibal got word of the schemes against him. Maybe it was a loyal servant, maybe a merchant friend, maybe just his own instinct. After all, this was a man who had read Roman strategy like an open book for decades. One night, realizing Rome's hand was closing around him, Hannibal made a quiet decision: exile. Better to leave Carthage on his own terms than be handed over in chains. He slipped out of the city secretly. Some say under the cover of darkness, others claim in broad daylight disguised as a merchant. Historians still debate which version is true. Personally, I like to imagine Hannibal haggling over dates and spices in a marketplace while sneaking past spice. It just feels suitably mischievous. His first stop was the court of King Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire in Syria. Antiochus welcomed him like a lost treasure. Here was the man who had nearly broken Rome itself. Hannibal quickly became an advisor, offering strategies and urging Antiochus to confront Rome before it grew even stronger. But court politics are trickier than battlefields, and Antiochus wasn't quite the eager student Hannibal might have hoped. Some generals ignored him, jealous of his reputation, while the king himself hesitated to give full command. Hannibal suggested a naval strike against Rome, but it never came to fruition. Still, he didn't fade away. In later years, he drifted to Crete, where legend says he once hid his personal treasure by filling clay jars with lead coins and burying them, just to trick would-be thieves. Whether true or not, it shows his mischievous side never vanished. Eventually, he found himself at the court of Prusias of Bithynia, In Asia Minor, Hannibal had become a wandering tactician, offering his talents to kings like a retired chess master challenging anyone brave enough to play dot, and even in exile, he couldn't resist outwitting Rome. When Rome sent fleets against Prusias, Hannibal devised a clever trick. He ordered clay jars filled with venomous snakes and hurled them onto Roman ships. Imagine the chaos: sailors expecting arrows and fire, suddenly dodging angry serpents slithering across the deck. It was as if Hannibal was saying, if elephants aren't allowed, snakes will do just fine. Yet, despite these flashes of brilliance, Hannibal was no longer the unstoppable force of his youth. He was an aging general without a nation, serving kings who valued him but feared provoking Rome too much. Wherever he went, Rome's shadow followed. Ambassadors demanded his surrender, senators plotted his downfall, and allies hesitated to protect him. Hannibal himself reportedly remarked that he had grown old, but Rome's hatred for him had not. The strangest detail of all, in some versions, Hannibal traveled with a small library, carrying scrolls on geography, strategy, and philosophy. Perhaps he studied in quiet moments, preparing his mind for battles that never came. Historians still debate whether this was true, but the image of the great general, now gray-haired, hunched over a scroll in a foreign court, is striking. For the people of Carthage, Hannibal's exile was bittersweet. Some admired him from afar, telling stories of his adventures, while others breathed easier knowing Rome's wrath had been diverted. Meanwhile, Roman parents continued to whisper his name at bedtime, "Behave, or Hannibal will come." The man had become a myth while still alive, but myths can't wander forever. The Roman Senate was patient, and Hannibal's enemies were tireless. He had fought legions, crossed mountains, and unleashed elephants, but now he was cornered by politics, age, and relentless pursuit. The stage was set for his final act. Hannibal's last years were not spent in roaring victories or dramatic charges, but in quiet defiance. The general who had marched elephants over the Alps was now a man in his 60s, wandering from court to court, always a step ahead of Roman emissaries. He had become less a commander and more a living symbol, a reminder to Rome that no matter how far their power stretched, one man could still haunt them. Eventually, he found refuge in Bithynia, under King Prusias. For a while, it seemed safe. Hannibal even lent his talents to Prusias' navy, pulling clever tricks like his famous snake jar attack, proving he still had that sly spark. Yet Rome's patience never ran out. Envoys arrived at Prusias' court, demanding the surrender of the aging Carthaginian. Prusias, torn between gratitude and fear, began to lean toward betrayal. Hannibal sensed it. He had always been a step ahead. After all, he had built a small villa near Libissa, and inside, hidden beneath the floorboards, he kept a vial of poison. This was his insurance policy, his last safeguard against the humiliation of Roman chains. To him, better to choose his own end than to be paraded through Rome in a triumph, mocked by the very people he had once terrified. One day, messengers came. The Romans were at his door. Hannibal smiled. At least, that's how some stories put it. He supposedly remarked, "Let us free Rome from their long anxiety, since they have found the time to wait for an old man's death." Then, calmly, he took the poison and ended his life. Historians debate the exact details. Was it poison in a ring, tucked away for years? Was he betrayed outright and forced to act? Some accounts even claim he staged his death to escape yet again. The truth is clouded, but the essence remains. Hannibal chose freedom on his own terms. Rome exhaled. After decades of war, fear, and shadow chasing, their most hated enemy was gone. But they had not conquered him. They had merely outlived him. And so, Hannibal's legend grew even larger. Parents still whispered his name. Historians still argued over his brilliance. And generals centuries later studied his campaigns. His ghost lingered on battlefields far beyond his time. And perhaps that was Hannibal's greatest victory. Not the blood spilled, not the cities burned, but the memory that endured. For while Rome triumphed, Hannibal remained unforgettable. The final lullaby, 300 words, and now, dear listener, we come to the soft closing of our story. The thunder of hooves has faded, the clash of swords has quieted, and the long marches across mountains and plains lie far behind. Hannibal, that restless spirit who once shook the world, rests at last. His tale may have ended, but in our imagination, he still moves, crossing rivers, planning ambushes, outsmarting his rivals with a quiet smile. But tonight, none of that matters. Tonight, you can set aside the weight of history and the noise of battles. The armies are gone, the banners lowered. What remains is silence, the kind of silence that comes after a storm, deep and comforting. Imagine lying beneath the same wide sky that Hannibal once studied, the stars glimmering softly like lanterns above. The air is cool, the night calm. In this quiet, there are no Romans, no Carthaginians, no victories or defeats, only the slow rhythm of your breath and the gentle pull of sleep. Perhaps Hannibal himself, old and weary, would have liked this moment, a chance to lay down burdens, to be free from politics, from enemies, from destiny itself. Perhaps, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the distant waves against the shore of Bithynia, lapping softly like a lullaby. Let that sound carry you, slowly, gently, into rest. Let the long shadows of the past fade, until all that remains is the warmth of your pillow, the comfort of safety, and the drifting pull of dreams. Sleep well, my friend. The battles are over. The story is told. And now, it is time for you to close your eyes and find your own quiet peace.